On June 17, 2026, Donald Trump signed the memorandum at the Palace of Versailles during dinner with French President Emmanuel Macron. In Tehran, Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian signed the same document the same night. Between them lay 4 months of war. A supreme leader gone. From a strike in February, missiles fired at American bases, at Israeli cities, at Gulf shipping lanes. The Strait of Hormuz, through which a fifth of the world's oil moves every day, closed to commercial shipping. And then, on the night of June 17th, both presidents signed a framework that extended the ceasefire and opened a path toward a final deal. You've probably heard pieces of this story. The strikes, the oil spike, a headline about a ceasefire. What almost nobody connected at the time is what those 4 months revealed about a country 7,000 miles from the battlefield. One that had spent 20 years quietly building its energy future around Iran staying exactly as it was. That country is China. The world watched in real time what happens when the foundation a rising power built its future on takes the worst-case hit and survives, bruised, in a shape nobody fully recognized. Let's start with the question most people get wrong. The question isn't what happened to Iran. If you've been following the news cycle on this, you've already been buried in that version. The strikes, the succession, the ceasefire terms, the geopolitical commentary from people who've been wrong about Iran for 40 years in a row. That's the story everyone's been telling, loudly. It's not the story that matters most. The question that actually matters, the one almost nobody in the West stopped to ask, is what happened, simultaneously, to the country 8,000 miles away that had quietly built its entire western flank around Iran, staying exactly where it was. That country is China. And here's where I want you to lean in, because this is the part that didn't make the front pages. In March of 2021, while most of the world was still arguing about vaccine rollouts, China and Iran signed something most Americans never heard about: a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement. Not a press release, not a photo op. A quarter-century framework covering oil, infrastructure, banking, telecommunications, even military cooperation. The kind of agreement you don't sign with a country you think might not exist in 5 years. China pledged up to $400 billion in investment over those 25 years. $400 billion. Now, here's what you need to know underneath that headline number. Very little of it had actually materialized by the time the war started. Chinese companies, nervous about triggering American sanctions, held back. The pledge was real. The money, largely, wasn't. But the intent, the strategic commitment, the architecture of the relationship, that was as real as anything Beijing had built anywhere in the world. So why Iran? Why not Saudi Arabia, who pumps more oil and doesn't carry the baggage of sanctions and isolation? Because Iran offered China something Saudi Arabia, for all its oil, never could: independence from the rules. Saudi Arabia sells oil to China, sure. But Saudi Arabia also sells oil to the United States, banks in dollars, buys American weapons, and still answers, however reluctantly, to a security architecture Washington anchors. Iran answered to no one. 4 decades outside the system, sanctioned, cut off from SWIFT, cut off from Western capital. For China, that isolation wasn't a liability. It was the entire point. A sanctioned, isolated Iran is a country with nowhere else to sell its oil, which means China could buy it at a discount, in whatever currency it wanted, through whatever channels it wanted, because the alternative for Iran was selling nothing at all. By 2025, well over 80% of Iran's total oil exports were flowing into Chinese refineries, mostly through a quiet network of independent facilities in Shandong province, the so-called teapot refineries, processing Iranian crude that, on paper, barely existed. This is the part I need you to sit with. China didn't just find a convenient oil supplier. China built, deliberately, over 2 decades, a relationship with a country that had no other options. And a country with no other options always says yes. That's not friendship, that's leverage. The kind you build slowly, the kind that only becomes visible the moment it's threatened. And in February of 2026, it was threatened more directly than anyone had modeled. So the question we're really exploring here isn't political, it's structural. When the regime that China had spent 25 years quietly betting on took an assassination, a war, a closed strait, and still didn't fall, what did China actually learn? What held? What broke? And what does Beijing do differently now that it's seen, live, exactly where its exposure was? That's where we're headed. But to understand the answers, you first have to understand the invisible system China had spent 20 years building, piece by piece, with Iran as the cornerstone nobody was watching. Because the most important thing about what happened in 2026 isn't the war itself. It's the architecture underneath the war that most people never saw coming, and that China had been quietly depending on for longer than most analysts wanted to admit. To understand what China actually built with Iran, you have to go back to a phrase almost nobody in America has ever heard, even though it explains half of what Beijing does in the world. The phrase is the Malacca Dilemma. In November 2003, China's president at the time stood up in front of the Communist Party's Central Committee and said something remarkably honest for a country that rarely admits weakness in public. He said China had a vulnerability, a single, narrow choke point that could strangle the entire economy if it were ever closed. That choke point is the Strait of Malacca, a stretch of water between Indonesia and Malaysia, barely 2.5 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Roughly 80% of China's oil imports pass through it. Every tanker, every drop, squeezed through a gap in the ocean that the United States Navy could, in theory, interdict in an afternoon. Think about that the way you'd think about your own business or your own household. Imagine 80% of everything you depend on, your income, your supplies, your fuel, running through one single road, one bridge, and someone else owns the checkpoint. You wouldn't sleep well. China didn't either. So since the mid-2000s, quietly, methodically, without ever announcing it as the headline strategy it actually is, China has been building a way around that bridge. Not instead of the sea routes, those still carry the bulk of the volume, but alongside them. A second option, a backup system for an economy that can't afford the lights to ever fully go out. That's what the Belt and Road Initiative actually is, underneath the press releases about bridges and ports. It's not generosity. It's not even really about trade in the simple sense. It's a hedge, an insurance policy written in steel, rail and asphalt, running west from China, through Central Asia, toward the Gulf and the Mediterranean, entirely over land, entirely outside the reach of any navy. And if you trace that hedge on a map, there's one country it has to pass through. One country sitting exactly where Central Asia, the Persian Gulf, and the routes toward Europe all converge. You already know which one. For years, China quietly extended freight rail lines through Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, terminating in Iranian territory. Container trains running from Chinese manufacturing cities all the way to Tehran, in a fraction of the time a ship would take around the Indian Ocean and through the Suez Canal. Iran also anchors what's called the International North-South Transport Corridor, a rail and shipping network linking Russia, the Caspian, and Iranian ports down to the edge of the Indian Ocean. A route that, again, never has to ask permission from Washington and never has to pass beneath an American carrier group. This is the part that should change how you see everything else in this story. Iran isn't just an oil supplier China happened to like. Iran is a load-bearing wall in the structure China spent 2 decades building to make itself harder to strangle. And it goes deeper than rail lines. When the United States cut Iran off from SWIFT, the global messaging system that lets banks move money across borders, Iran became, almost by accident, the perfect laboratory for something China had wanted to build anyway. A financial settlement system that doesn't run through Western institutions at all. Yuan-denominated oil payments. Transactions routed through China's own alternative to SWIFT, a system called SIPS. Still small by global standards, but growing every year that sanctions push more countries to look for alternatives. Iran didn't ask to be the test case, but it became one. And every transaction that worked made the next country's decision to do the same a little easier to justify. So when February of 2026 came, when the strikes happened, when Hormuz closed, when the oil market seized, the question the world should have been asking wasn't just about Iran's government surviving. It was about all of this. The rail lines, the settlement system, the entire quiet architecture China had been building in the shadow of Iran's isolation for 2 decades, without most of the world noticing. Most people only ever saw the oil tankers. They never saw the railroads, the yuan settlements, the decade of careful engineering underneath them, until the day it all went through its first real stress test at once. Let's put some numbers on the table, because this story only means something once you see the scale of it. As of 2025, China imported roughly 11 million barrels of crude oil a day, more than any country on Earth. Of that, estimates put Iranian crude at somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million barrels a day, flowing into Chinese refineries, mostly at a meaningful discount to market price. That discount alone represents tens of billions of dollars a year, not symbolic, not a goodwill gesture between old friends, real money every single day flowing in one direction because Iran had nowhere else to send it. Here's where the official trade numbers get complicated, and it's worth slowing down on this. China's own customs data reported bilateral trade with Iran at around $13 billion in 2024. But that figure deliberately excludes the oil, because the oil flows through sanctioned channels Beijing doesn't officially acknowledge. When you add the unreported Iranian crude exports to China, which US government analysts estimated at over $30 billion in 2025 alone, total annual economic exchange between the two countries climbs well past $40 billion. Iran's oil revenue from China accounted for roughly 45% of Iran's entire government budget. 45% of a government's operating funds coming from a single buyer who could, in theory, turn the tap down any time it wanted. That's not a trade relationship. That's a dependency with a face painted on it. Now here's where history earns its place in this conversation, because we've actually seen this exact dynamic before. We just watched it from the other side. In 1979, the United States lost Iran. Not gradually, not through a managed transition. The Shah, a man Washington had backed, armed, and built an entire regional strategy around for over 25 years, fled the country in January. Within weeks, the government America had anchored its entire Middle East posture to simply ceased to exist. The new regime didn't inherit America's relationships. It burned them, deliberately. Starting with the seizure of the US Embassy in Tehran that November, overnight, the United States lost its primary military partner in the Gulf, its intelligence-gathering posts along the Soviet border. Billions of dollars in military hardware the new government would no longer service through American contractors, and a relationship 2.5 decades in the making. Washington didn't see it coming with the speed it actually happened. The CIA's own assessments, as late as the summer of 1978, suggested the Shah's government was stable for years to come. It collapsed in 6 months. Now, I'm not telling you this to draw a perfect parallel. History doesn't repeat with that kind of precision, and Beijing's relationship with Tehran was structured very differently than Washington's was with the Shah. China never put its own soldiers on Iranian soil. It never tied its credibility to one ruler's survival the way the US did with the Shah personally. But in one way, the parallel is exactly the warning it always was. The United States, with all of its intelligence apparatus, with decades of on-the-ground relationships, with a CIA station that had operated inside Iran for a generation, still didn't see 1979 coming until it was already happening. China's intelligence picture inside Iran, by most outside assessments, is considerably thinner. Beijing's relationships ran through the state apparatus, oil ministries, banking officials, party-to-party channels with the ruling establishment, not through civil society, not through the military's mid-level officer corps, not through the kind of penetration that tells you what a country's streets are actually thinking. Which is why, when February 2026 came and the strikes began, Beijing did exactly what its doctrine prescribed. It condemned the strikes publicly, called for restraint, and did nothing else. The words were carefully chosen. The actions were not. So hold these two numbers in your head as we go forward. 11 million barrels a day and 45% of a government's budget. One is how much China moved. The other is how much Iran needed China to keep moving it. Those numbers didn't change when the war started. What changed is what they revealed about who actually had the leverage. Here's where the story stops being simple. Because underneath everything we've covered so far, there's a paradox sitting at the center of this relationship. One that, the longer you look at it, starts to feel less like a strategy and more like a trap China built for itself without quite realizing it. The paradox is this: the very thing that made Iran such a perfect partner for China was the same thing that was slowly killing Iran from the inside. Walk through it with me. China got its discount, its leverage, its loyal customer with nowhere else to turn, specifically because Iran was isolated. Cut off from SWIFT, cut off from Western capital, cut off from the normal buyers who would have paid full price without demanding a deal that only makes sense for someone with no other options. That isolation was the entire foundation of the relationship. Take it away, let Iran rejoin the international financial system, let it sell oil to Europe and Japan and India at market rates, and Iran stops needing China's discount rate no questions asked arrangement. The whole relationship only worked because Iran was desperate. But desperation isn't a stable state. It's not a foundation you can build a 25-year plan on top of and expect it to hold still. The same sanctions that pushed Iran into China's arms were the sanctions strangling its currency, hollowing out its middle class, pricing ordinary families out of meat and medicine and rent. The same isolation that made Iran a captive customer had been radicalizing a generation of young Iranians, people who'd never known their country with functioning banks, who'd watched their savings evaporate, who took to the streets every few years, not for politics in the abstract, but because they simply couldn't afford to live. Every year that isolation deepened China's discount. It also deepened the conditions that made conflict more likely. Think about it the way you'd think about a landlord who's found the perfect tenant, someone who never complains, never negotiates, pays whatever's asked because they have nowhere else to go. It looks like the ideal arrangement, right up until the day that tenant stops being able to pay any more, and you realize the entire relationship was built on a fragility you chose not to look at too closely. China didn't create Iran's internal contradictions. That's worth saying plainly. The economic collapse, the generational anger, the pressure that had been building for decades, all of that long predates China's role as Iran's primary lifeline. But China spent 20 years quietly benefiting from precisely the conditions that made 2026 possible, profiting from the fever while betting the patient wouldn't break. And here's the part of the paradox that was confirmed by the war itself. China couldn't intervene, even when it wanted to. Beijing's entire foreign policy doctrine, going back to the 1950s, repeated in every white paper since, is built around non-interference. China doesn't send troops to prop up governments under pressure. It doesn't run the kind of direct political intervention Russia ran in Syria to keep Assad in power through a civil war. It's not in China's playbook, not in its self-image, not in the diplomatic language Beijing uses to position itself as a different kind of power than the West. Which is why, when February 2026 came and the strikes began, China's response was the one it had always promised: public condemnations of the strikes as violations of the UN Charter, calls for restraint, statements about peaceful resolution, words carefully chosen that pointed nowhere in particular. Beijing condemned what happened loudly enough to satisfy Iran, quietly enough to avoid provoking Washington. Not silence, something more calculated than silence. The absence of any action that might actually change anything. We now know how that played out. Iran's government didn't fall. The regime absorbed the worst external military strike in its history, replaced its supreme leader under IRGC pressure, and signed a memorandum that, however fragile, opened a diplomatic path nobody had predicted would exist. China's strategic investment survived, battered, reconfigured, facing a very different Iran than the one it built the deal with, but surviving. That changes the question entirely. Not what happens to China if Iran falls, but what does Beijing do differently now that it knows exactly where its exposure is and exactly how little control it has over what happens next? So let's talk about what actually happened. Not the headlines, the structural consequences, the ones that will still be reshaping decisions in Beijing 5 years from now. When the strikes began on February 28, 2026, China's immediate problem wasn't political, it was physical. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz within days, taking not just Iranian oil, but roughly 40% of China's daily crude imports through that corridor. China's teapot refineries in Shandong went quiet almost immediately. The rail corridor through Iran, built as Beijing's answer to the Malacca problem, became unusable overnight. The architecture China had built as a backup system failed at exactly the moment a backup system is supposed to work. Beijing's response to this disruption was revealing. When the US sanctioned Chinese refineries processing Iranian crude, China did something it had never done before. It invoked a blocking rule, formally ordering Chinese companies to disregard American sanctions as violations of international law. A defiant move on paper. In practice, the National Financial Regulatory Administration simultaneously ordered Chinese banks to stop extending new loans to the same sanctioned refineries. China pushed back against Washington publicly and complied privately. That contradiction, assertive rhetoric, cautious behavior, is the clearest single image of how Beijing operated throughout this entire war. That's the first consequence. Not catastrophic. China has reserves and diversified suppliers. But a demonstration in real time of the core vulnerability. When Hormuz closed, China found out that the Malacca dilemma hadn't been solved. It had just been moved. The second consequence is more interesting, and almost nobody covered it correctly. China's strategic patience, its refusal to intervene, its careful positioning, its condemnations without action, looked, from one angle, like weakness. Iran's own hardliners said so publicly. And yet Beijing's position was, in a narrow sense, vindicated. Iran's government survived, the relationship survived, and China emerged without having alienated either side enough to lose access to whatever comes next. That's not nothing. It's a sophisticated play, except that it only works because someone else paid the price to keep the foundation intact. The third consequence is the one I want you to sit with, because it cuts deepest. In the 47 years between 1979 and 2026, a hostile, sanctioned Iran functioned, almost by accident, as a permanent American distraction. Every carrier group in the Gulf, every diplomatic hour, every defense dollar dedicated to containing Tehran was a resource not pointed at the Pacific, not pointed at Taiwan, not pointed at the one rivalry that actually defines this century. China didn't design this, but it benefited from it every year. From February 28, 2026 onward, the US became consumed by an active war in the Middle East, spending political capital, military assets, and global attention on a conflict it couldn't fully control. For months, the South China Sea got quieter. Taiwan got quieter. Every conversation about Indo-Pacific deterrence got pushed down the news cycle. China didn't fire a single shot and bought itself 4 months of reduced pressure in the theater that matters most to it. But here's where the story turns in a direction almost no one anticipated. And this is the consequence that will matter most over the next decade. The Islamabad Memorandum includes meaningful sanctions relief for Iran. The US agreed to issue waivers for Iranian crude exports, unfreeze Iranian assets, support a $300 billion reconstruction fund. The details remain contested, but the Islamabad Memorandum established a direction, and even if that direction stalls, the fact that it was signed at all changes the calculus permanently. And here is the paradox that closes the loop on everything we've discussed here. The one outcome that ends China's leverage over Iran isn't Iran's collapse. It's Iran's recovery. A sanctioned Iran had nowhere to sell its oil except China, at whatever price Beijing offered. An Iran with sanctions relief can sell to Europe, to Japan, to India, to anyone willing to pay market rates. An Iran with a functioning banking system no longer needs yuan-denominated shadow transactions. An Iran with access to Western capital markets doesn't need Chinese investment on Chinese terms. The entire structure of dependency China spent 20 years building was built on Iran having no other option. The war, paradoxically, may have given Iran back its options, not through collapse, but through survival. China's 25-year bet on a desperate Iran may be about to win in the worst possible way. Iran survives and stops being desperate. That's not a scenario that appears in any public Chinese strategic document, and it means that whatever Beijing builds next with Tehran, it will be negotiating from a very different position than the one it held in March of 2021, when it signed that agreement with a country that had nowhere else to turn. The question now isn't what happens to China if Iran falls. It's what happens to China's strategy now that the Iran it built that strategy around no longer quite exists. If you've made it this far with me, through the rail lines and the teapot refineries and the blocking rules and the ceasefire signed at the Palace of Versailles, I want to ask you for something small before we close this out. Subscribe to this channel. That's it. We do this here. Take a story everyone thinks they understand and find the layer underneath it that nobody bothered to explain. It costs you nothing, and it tells me you want more of this kind of thinking, not less. And drop a comment before you leave. Not a reaction, an actual thought. Which country do you think is wearing Iran's role right now? Which government is quietly leaning on Beijing because nobody else will take the call? I read these. I want to know what you're seeing that I might not be. Now, back to Beijing. Because there's one more question this war raised that hasn't been answered yet, and it might be the most important one of all. We've established that China's investments survived. The regime didn't fall. The ceasefire fractured almost immediately, with both sides accusing the other of violations, and traffic through the Strait of Hormuz repeatedly disrupted as tensions escalated. The framework established by the June 17th memorandum gave both sides a narrow, contested, and fragile window to negotiate a final deal. But the substance of that deal remains unclear, as does whether Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, elevated in the first weeks of the war amid reports of significant IRGC influence, has either the authority or the inclination to honor commitments made by a government that had, for a time, been fighting for its survival. That uncertainty is China's real problem, not the oil disruption, however prolonged, not the rail corridor that will reopen. The real problem is that the Iran that signed the 2021 agreement no longer exists in the form that signed it. The supreme leader who endorsed it is dead. The government that negotiated it spent 4 months absorbing the largest foreign military campaign against an Iranian state since the Iran-Iraq War. The IRGC, which emerged from this conflict with consolidated political power and a new patron in Mujtaba, has its own interests in how the relationship with China develops, interests that don't necessarily align with the oil ministry officials and banking technocrats who actually manage the day-to-day relationship Beijing built its plan around. In other words, the agreement is intact on paper. The relationship it was supposed to govern has been fundamentally altered by events neither side planned for, and Beijing knows it. Which is why the more revealing signal came not from China, but from Iran. In the weeks following the ceasefire, Iran's own foreign minister made his first in-person visit to Beijing since the war began, not to celebrate the outcome, but to reaffirm ties and secure guarantees that China would not make concessions to Washington that might damage Tehran's position. Think about what that visit means structurally. Iran, having just survived the worst military campaign in its modern history, flew to Beijing to make sure China was still on its side. The desperate partner checking in with the indispensable one. The relationship held, but the terms of it, who needs whom and how visibly, were now on the table in a way they hadn't been before the war. That visit also carried a specific anxiety. Throughout the conflict, the Trump administration had been pressuring Beijing to use its influence over Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, essentially asking China to spend its leverage on Washington's behalf. Iran wanted clarity. Was Beijing going to comply? Was China willing to trade Iranian interests for a smoother path toward Trump's state visit to Beijing? The foreign minister flew to find out. The fact that he had to ask the question at all tells you something important about how the relationship had shifted. Before the war, that question didn't need to be asked out loud. China's position was assumed. After 4 months of conflict, during which China provided dual-use technology and diplomatic cover, while carefully stopping short of anything that might draw direct American retaliation, Iran was no longer certain of the answer. Here's what I'd be watching if I were in Beijing. Not the nuclear negotiations. Those are Washington's problem to resolve. What I'd be watching is the Reconstruction Fund. The $300 billion Reconstruction and Development Fund is a private investment vehicle. Companies from South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, and the United States, among those named as early committers, spanning energy, logistics, manufacturing, and transport. China is conspicuously absent from that list, which means the economic opening of Iran, the very event that ends China's leverage, is being architected by the same Western and Asian economies that spent 4 decades locked out of Tehran, along with everyone else. This is the strategic irony that Beijing has to sit with. For 20 years, China benefited from Iran's isolation because everyone else stayed out. Now that everyone else is being invited back in, China finds itself in a position it has almost no experience navigating, competing on equal terms in a market it used to own. Not through sanctions or force, but through the simple arithmetic of Iran having options again. When you're the only buyer, you set the price. When you're one buyer among a dozen, you make an offer and wait. If that fund materializes, if a final deal gets done, and Iran's economy genuinely reintegrates into global markets, China will find itself competing for influence in a country it once had largely to itself. Not as the only buyer, as one buyer among many. Not as the indispensable partner, as a legacy partner navigating a relationship that has fundamentally changed shape around it. The method doesn't change, only the terms do. And for the first time in 20 years, China doesn't get to set them. Let's go back to where we started. That memorandum, signed at the Palace of Versailles on the night of June 17th, 2026, by a man who had just watched his country fight a war against a government whose supreme leader they had killed 4 months earlier. The men in Beijing who had spent 20 years building the architecture we've been talking about here, the rail lines, the teapot refineries, the yuan settlements, the quiet infrastructure of a relationship designed to outlast any single administration in Tehran. Those men didn't celebrate when the ceasefire was signed. They assessed. Because what the war revealed wasn't just China's exposure. It revealed the limits of a method China had been relying on for 2 decades without ever truly testing it. The method was this: find the desperate, because the desperate have no other options. Build deep with them. Make yourself indispensable through their isolation, not through your own strength. Let their weakness become your leverage. It worked. For a long time, it worked remarkably well. And then the war came, and in 4 months, the world did something to Iran that China had never anticipated. It gave Iran a path back. Not a clean path, not a guaranteed path. A framework for negotiations, a reconstruction fund nobody agrees on how to fund, a nuclear deal that may collapse before it concludes. But a path. The direction of travel changed, and when the direction changes, leverage built on a fixed position quietly starts to erode. This isn't a story about China losing. China didn't lose. The relationship survived. The oil will flow again. The rail lines will reopen. Whatever Mujtaba Khamenei's government ultimately becomes, it will still need revenue, still need trade partners, still need the infrastructure Beijing spent years building. The connection will hold, in some form, for some time. But it's a different connection now, built on different terms, between two parties who both just learned something about how the other operates under real pressure, in the worst possible circumstances. Iran learned that China, for all its statements of solidarity, would not lift a finger to protect it when the strikes began. China learned that Iran, for all its dependency, could be peeled away, not by collapse, not by revolution, but by a deal that restored what isolation had taken. Both sides walked out of this war knowing something about the other they couldn't have known before. That kind of knowledge doesn't disappear. It just gets folded into every conversation that comes after. Great powers have always built their cheapest leverage in someone else's desperation. Britain did it. The Soviet Union did it. America did it with the Shah and lost it overnight in 1979. China studied that history. It built its version more carefully, more patiently, with fewer soldiers and more contracts. And still, the same fundamental vulnerability found it. You cannot control what you do not own. You cannot protect an investment you've promised the world you'll never send troops to defend. You can only watch and call for restraint and hope the foundation holds long enough for the method to outlast the moment. Sometimes it does. This time, it did. Barely. The question Beijing is sitting with, in the rooms you'll never see, with the men who don't appear on television, isn't how to mourn what almost happened. It's how to build the next version of this, with whatever country becomes the next Iran, isolated, sanctioned, desperate, and willing to say yes to terms nobody else will offer. Because the method doesn't require Iran specifically. It requires a country with no other options. And the world, at any given moment, is never short of those. There's a list somewhere that nobody publishes. Countries under sanctions, governments cut off from Western capital, regimes that have run out of friends willing to be seen with them in public. China doesn't need to conquer those countries. It doesn't need to govern them or defend them or be responsible for what happens inside their borders. It just needs to be the last phone call they can make, the one that always gets answered on terms the other side can't afford to refuse. That's not empire. It's something quieter than empire and in some ways more durable. Empires announce themselves. This method never does. The method survives. Only the address changes. And the address right now is somewhere you're probably not watching closely enough. That's the next video. If this changed even slightly how you'll read the next headline about China or Iran or whatever comes after, that's enough. That's all I set out to do.
Follow this channel. We go deep like this here, on the pieces of the world that actually shape the next decade, not just the parts that trend for a day. And if this gave you something worth sharing, send it to 5 people who think clearly about the world. Not because I need the number, because they deserve to hear this kind of thinking from someone they trust. Leave a comment. Tell me where you think this goes next, whether you think a final deal gets done, or whether the framework collapses and we're back where we started. Tell me what you want me to dig into next. The next country playing Iran's role. The next strategic bet nobody is watching closely enough. I read every one. The ceasefire was signed at Versailles. But somewhere, quietly, a new architecture is already being built for the next country with nowhere else to turn.